We've modeled and we have UV unwrapped this entire thing, and now it's time to get started texturing. And I'll show you my workflow for that, which I think is actually a pretty interesting workflow because I can't draw or paint all too well. So what I end up doing is going back into layout mode here for a second. I start off in edit mode and I select, in this case, all of the eyes, because these are all going to be emissive and red. Then I make a new material and I call that, let's say, just eyes. And I assign that new material to all of the things I have selected at that specific time. And this is going to be, if we switch into material preview, base color black, and then the emission color is probably going to be like red or something like that, right? And this is going to create a pretty big list of separate materials for separate parts of the mesh. In the end of the process, when we finished all of the texturing, we're going to bake that all down into a single texture, then bring that back into a single material that we can then easily use in a game engine like Unreal or Unity without having to import a absolute boatload of different materials and different texture maps, and that just being inefficient. So I know that these little channels that we've created here are going to be a separate material as well. So we'll make that a selection. And then of course also the back part of the body is going to be the same thing. The channels are going to be their own material. So now with all of that selected, again, we'll just make a new material. We'll call this energy or something like that. And for the time being, I'm just going to make the base color for that a light bluish kind of deal. We'll assign it. And this way we start getting a decent view as to what the rough approximation should look like for all these different things. Now, the towers themselves are going to be a separate texture. There might be a little bit of texture painting going on here, because I don't think we're going to be able to do this entirely procedurally, but I'm going to try. Because again, I suck at actually painting. So let's make that a darkish brown kind of color. Then the two body parts, which are a lot of different little islands and segments, are going to share one material. And I think the mouth itself is going to be separate materials from body, I want to say. So we'll make a material for the body, and for now we'll make that a different shade of brown. Of course, the fangs are going to be their own separate material as well. And now we get to the interesting bit, because I'm not entirely sure what I want to do with like these mechanical joints as far as materials go. The legs themselves obviously are going to be a separate material as well. It's probably going to be a dark black kind of material. So let's make that black just for previewing purposes. Then the tops of these towers are going to... what should I call this? I'm just going to call this elec for electric. Because that's what it's going to be in the end. And then I'm thinking this and this is going to be one material, and then the middle part is going to be a different material. So we can create a mouth outer and a mouth inner. I think I'm going to make these circular and these more torus shaped parts of these joints both the same material, is what I'm deciding right here and right now. I actually don't need to make a new material for this, because I already have a material that's only those things, because that's the only thing that's left. And we can just remove that texture from this, and now we have a... let's make this like a dark blue. That's not the color it's going to be in the end, but now we have a rough approximation of what the like color blocking is going to look like for this guy. Again, with the exception of the blue here, because I don't know what I'm going to do with those yet. And now we go through one by one and design these procedural materials to go onto this object. So let's start with the body, because I want to start here with a Voronoi texture. And I'll just preview what that looks like. I actually want to have the distance to edge. Let's add some mapping nodes here, because we want to use the UV for this, because we UV unwrap this thing for a goddamn reason, didn't we? And then we scale this way down. This is now a gradient. I want this to be actually like harsh lines. We can do that in a number of different ways. We can say a less than node, which gives us the option to create a map that looks something like this. And I actually really like this. For now, let's put that into a mix color node. And we're going to use that as the factor. And that's going to go into the color for our principal BSDF. For now, we can just pick 2 colors. So let's go with a brown-ish color. And let's go with black. And we want to set this bottom one from being color to being mix. So that it actually like mixes between the 2 of these. And that then creates this kind of cracked looking effect. These lines might be a tiny bit too straight though. I mean, they're pretty fine, but having a little bit of wiggliness to them might actually look a little bit better, is what I'm thinking right now. And also the contrast to them needs to be significantly higher, so we want to have them be like actually black, and maybe have this be a little bit brighter. Anyway, what we're doing is creating wiggliness, and the way we're going to do that is coming off this mapping node. What we're going to do is we'll pull off and get a mix linear light. Putting off the same mapping again, we'll actually get a noise texture this time using the same mapping coordinates, and that's going to go into the bottom here. And if we then use the output of that as the new vector for the Voronoi, we'll be able to see everything gets distorted. If we put this down to 0, it's entirely non-distorted. If we put this up to 1, it's a really weird looking mess, which also a neat effect, not what we're going for right now. So this distorts the lines a little bit, but not quite in the way that I was anticipating. And that is because if we preview the noise texture, it's really big. Like there's hardly any noise going on here. So if we increase the scale here, we can actually start seeing the noise texture. And if we then go into the Voronoi texture, or rather the less than, for a better view of things, let's just go into the principal BSDF actually. We can start seeing that that might have been a bit much, to be honest. Let's go for like 50. If we up the roughness as well, that also creates some more detail. That can help in making things a little bit more jagged instead of all wibbly wobbly. And it only needs to be a little bit of distortion. But as you can see, now the lines here are no longer perfectly straight. So we can maybe 0.03. That might be a little much already. 2. And of course we can layer this in multiple layers. So if we want to just like copy and paste this over, create a second noise texture here, and then the output from that linear light goes through this one, and that then goes into the Voronoi texture. Now we can also make a noise texture that is a little less rough and a little less detailed, and creates more of the bigger wibbly wobbly kind of distortions. And that one we might want to put up a little higher in the mixing factor. And now we have a decent look for like the cracked shell of this stone, like ancient golem kind of being. That's all fantastic, but that is all just to generate the lines between what's going to be the actual texture. So the actual texture itself, I am not entirely sure what we're going to do with yet. So I'm going to start with a Musgrave texture, which is a different type of noise texture, and we're actually going to use the same mapping coordinates for that as well, using the UVs. As you can see, it's a more rough kind of noise texture compared to the way this noise texture looks, which is a lot softer. This is a lot more individual blobs of white on a black background. And if we lower the dimension value of this, that's actually pretty good. I think I'm going to use that. And we're going to put that into a color ramp. Anyway, so let's make a dark brown-ish kind of color for the base color. And then the dirt layer that's on top of that is going to be... It's a very good question. What color are we going to make that? A slightly lighter brown seems to work quite well, actually. That's not bad. I quite like that. We can put this into the mix color now instead. And now we'll see that instead of just being that one solid color, this mixed color will now mix between the texture we just created and the black lines. Now, for the time being, I'm just going to increase the roughness here by quite a bit. We'll eventually make a roughness map, most likely, as well, but I want it to be fairly non-reflective. So, you can give detail to your textures with color, but what's probably more important in a lot of situations is creating a pretty good normal map. And that's what we're going to be doing next. So, we want to, for the things beneath the dirt, have a certain normal map. So that light interacts with that a certain way. And then the dirt itself is going to have a different normal map. So that light interacts with it slightly differently. So first and foremost, let's pull off this again and let's see what type of texture we want to use for this. Probably just a normal noise texture, to be honest. But we could use a magic texture. Just let's look at what that looks like. I don't think that's gonna do it. What if we put this through a separate color and just look at the red or the green or the blue channel? Okay, interesting. This is a pretty interesting pattern to keep in mind. I've never actually worked with this before, having them separated out like that. And I actually think that this might be a pretty fun pattern to work with. So let's go for that right now. And put that into a color ramp so that we have influence over the contrast. It's not good for tryptophobia, but then again, this is also not good for arachnophobia. So if you've got any type of phobia, don't watch this video. Anyway, the output for that is going to go into a bump node. And instead of the strength, it's going to go into the height value. And we'll plug that into the normal here. And what does that look like? Okay, so we don't want it to be too contrasty, but maybe if we like lower the white a little bit, that lower the white a little bit, that looks interesting. Yeah, not really. It also gives them a leathery or scaly kind of look, and I like it more than I thought I would, to be honest. Maybe the strength can be a little bit lower. Oh, hold on a moment here. This is kind of neat. If we increase the strength back up. Yeah, I like this. It's kind of like a in-between of a... Well, it's not a honeycomb, because a honeycomb is a hexagon, and this is just squares. Slightly distorted squares, but it's just squares. So it does give that kind of scaly look, which is... Again, I don't dislike it. Alright, so yeah, let's go with that for now. And we'll take this color output, and actually, before we do the bump node, we'll multiply this with the output of our Musgrave texture. And you'll be able to see that we now... If we set the factor to 1, we only have this bump map, which we're going to be using in the places where we don't have the dirt. So if we put this into the height, we'll now see that wherever we have that dirt texture that we've made before, the lighter brown, we shouldn't have... Okay, I just needed to pull it through a color ramp node. And there you can see this is actually the wrong way around now. So if we put an inversion node there, we might need to put a color ramp in between here as well to make this effect a little stronger. And the great thing is we can just pull this through another inversion node again, and we have the exact same mask now, but for the actual dirt texture. So we can just create, and for this we're just going to simply go for a normal noise texture because that's pretty good. And what we do is we just scale the ever-living hell out of it until it's very, very small. We pull it through a color ramp just so that we have some control over the contrast there. We multiply it with the negative mask we've just made. And that then can just go into a new bump node, into the height, where the normal from this one can just go into the normal from the one we already made. And as easily as that, now our dirt should have some detail to it as well. It's in need of some definite polish. I'll be the first to admit that. But I do like the idea that that top layer is armor. So maybe if we can use a Voronoi texture for that. Because we can do something similar to what we did before, and that's using the distance to edge. Scaling the ever-living hell out of it. And then decrease the randomness a certain amount. Making it a little more uniform. And then putting that into there. instead. And then we probably want to invert this. And we invert the bump map again, because we just keep inverting things left, right, and center. Put its strength significantly higher, and maybe even up the distance a little bit. The reason I like this is because it actually kind of looks like a spiderweb kind of pattern. Together with also making it feel still a little cracked or old, and you could also interpret this as being like pieced together armor pieces that I've flaked off, as we talked about before. So I quite like this look. Now I do think that adding a little color variation to this as well, on top of having different like normals for those bits, is probably a good idea too. So let's see, what output do we need for that? That's this. So we'll just copy over this mix color. That'll be the factor. It's kind of faking ambient occlusion this way, right? And I kind of like that. My only question is, should it be black? Or should we go for a slightly different color? Like, it could be cool if this has a little bit of like blueness to it. I think that is a good start for the body itself. Now, in order for everything to not entirely shit itself while I work on the other texture, I'm going to disconnect these two things. Specifically, the normal map is probably what's causing most of the... Yeah, so we can keep the color map for a little bit of reference while we're working on the rest. But we'll reconnect the normal map at the very end, because we have quite a bit of calculation going on here to calculate the normals. And that's just pretty computing intensive. So let's move on to something a little easier. That being the legs. I feel like the legs are going to be relatively easy. I want to start off with a wave texture and just see how that works out. We can, let's see, use the UV coordinates for that. If we increase the scale for that, it actually follows the curves of the legs, which is fantastic. I was afraid that I was gonna have to rotate it, but then again, you could just like rotate the Y and Z in theory. That should work, right? But it doesn't look like I had to do any of that. So this allows us to have a, well, waving texture that's more or less just a sine wave, and add some distortion to it to make it a little less rigid. We can also add some detail to it, which usually it's a good thing, right? Adding detail. We can give it more roughness, which is... It's slightly different from the actual detail function, but it adds more visual detail as well. And we want to make sure that with the face offset, we create a texture that blends this together decently well. In case you're ever doing something like this and you have your UVs packed in a way that creates lines the wrong way around, you can just say use the Y value instead, and that creates... That also is kind of cool though. I think I like this one a bit more. Let's add some color and see how I feel. And of course we do that through a color ramp node. And as I said before, this is going to be a pretty dark material, mostly black and dark gray with maybe a little bit of a blue tint to it. That could be cool. And this is slightly lighter, but not by much. And let's see if we increase the contrast on that a little bit. Now compare that to... Now it just looks like he's wearing striped socks, which is not great. So I think this is the better option here. I feel as if maybe copying over this texture and making a version of this that's just like non-distorted. And by the way, you can increase the detail all you want. So if you don't have any distortion, it's just gonna be a sine wave. Maybe doing that will actually look better without all the unnecessary added detail. I mean, it's a little sharp, but that we can fix with a curve. So if we just ease this a little more. And I just realized we don't need the invert node. That's just dumb because we have an invert button, like a checkbox here on the bump node itself. Still not really doing it, is it? Nah, let's just ignore that ID. That just didn't seem to work out too well. What we'll do instead is something similar to what we did before, and that is use a noise texture, scale the ever living hell out of it, and then just multiply that with the wave texture. So we only get those normals now on the parts that are white, and the parts that are white are the purple parts. So in theory, if we now put this into a bump node, that should give us extra detail on the purple parts, but not the black parts, hopefully. Yeah, now it's giving us extra detail everywhere. I guess we might simply just need to put a color ramp in between these to increase the contrast a little bit and make things a little more black. Let's give that a shot. Yeah, that's where the issue lies. Okay, so now we have a noise texture specifically for the purple parts. What I'm going to do for the fangs is very easy. It's the same thing I do for the horns on one of my other demons. So let's add a simple noise texture. You'll note that I use a lot of noise textures because just mixing and matching noise textures is honestly the main thing in my entire workflow to make texture work, because again, I can't paint things on manually because I suck at that. So that just goes into a color ramp, and that color ramp goes into the base color. This entire thing gets mapping coordinates. We change that to UVs. Actually, maybe we'll keep this one and generate it to prevent these stitch lines. So let's scale these a little bit so that we can see at least some noise variation in them. And then what we do is we just make this a lighter gray color with maybe a little yellowness in it. We make this a yellowish greenish kind of color and pull down the brightness for that a little as well. The colors don't work that well, do they? Maybe if we use the color picker and match that color with... actually, that might be not too bad. And then if we match this other color with the lighter color from that, that is bad, however. But if we make this a little lighter, a bit more yellow, and maybe scale this back, that works well enough for the fangs. And you can see there's no seams here because we're using the generated object coordinates. We could also just use the object. They're very similar, but we have to not scale as much. Effectively the same, or at least very similar. And since these are fangs, which are effectively bones, they don't really need any fine detail to them, and they can be a little reflective as well. So we're going to keep the roughness at about this value. That makes them too reflective. Maybe makes them a little more reflective though. Now these little link bits, I think I called them the just material. Okay, let's start with a Musgrave texture for these, and once again, let's keep them at generated for now. We can always move to UVs, but there's not really reason to use the UV coordinates here, I don't think. And I'm using this Musgrave here because that's a very good one to make it so that it looks like there's like damage, things are being chipped away from. Because it's got this very blobby consistency where there's a lot of black and then some white parts, and you can use that as a mask to isolate little islands on your object. And as I said before, you can use them very, very well for a grunge or dirt map like this. And I kind of want to have these feel like almost a rusty kind of type. But I don't want them to be actually metallic, because partly because baking things while metallic is enabled in Blender is a nightmare, and then baking the actual metallic map is also iffy, so I'd rather just avoid that. But we can use this in the roughness map, for instance, and you can see that gets pretty close. We probably want to put that through a color ramp as usual, just so that we're not using a spectrum from 0 to 1, because we don't really want it to be at 0. We probably want it to be like 30-ish%. That's more like 50%. rough to, well, 100% rough is actually a pretty good range to be at. And we can just like lower this down a little bit. Probably keep the mapping node up here. And let's see what other type of textures we might be able to use. Maybe we can use a Voronoi texture again. I always like using those. Usually they're for more organic type things, but maybe it works here as well. Let's just try and see. There's a lot of settings to a Voronoi texture, so that is always a nice thing to work with. Although I don't think it's gonna do the trick for us today here. But let's make this, for now, similar colors to the colors that we've been using for the body. Put them into the base color and just see what that looks like on the material itself. Gonna need a little more contrast into that to make that work. I think I'm gonna copy this Musgrave texture roughness map over to the main body material as well, because we haven't had a roughness map for that one yet. And I really kind of like the look of this. You just need to dial in exactly like where the roughness starts. Now, as far as the colors for these chains go, because that's what we're actually working on, I don't think that this noise texture actually works too well. Let's also see what it looks like. The colors work decently well, I think. They're not perfect, but it's just the Voronoi texture is not it. Maybe we use a Musgrave for this as well, or maybe we just go back to our old trusty noise textures, because those always fucking work. Yeah, the Musgrave actually works pretty good. It needs some normals though, still. And we're gonna do, again, the exact same technique here. We're going to use this exact same map also as a mask. Which is the great thing about this procedural shit, is you can reuse a lot of the things that you're working with. And now we're going to go back to our good old trusty noise texture, because that remains the most useful texture in all of 3D design. And see how detailed it needs to be in order to make sense. We want to set the factor to 1 to make sense to use in a context like this. Put a color ramp in between here, again, for contrast purposes. Yeah, the scale is much too high. Or maybe it's the roughness that's too high, actually. Let's put that into a bump node, and then into the normal, and see what this looks like, because it's probably going to be shit. Yeah, that's pretty shit. If we invert it though, it's probably still going to be shit. Scale this a little more. Put down the strength, and honestly that ain't bad. Create a separate noise texture with a slightly different pattern, and that's all there is to it. So put that into there, and now it's going to be like 100% the same, of course. But now we can just like change the scale on this. If we put the scale for this to like 50-ish. But this one isn't going to be very rough. You can see that it's different to make things rough from being very like finely done through scale. Yeah, that seems about right. And actually, instead of an invert node, what I'm going to do is add a color ramp here, because that gives me a little finer control over what we're actually doing. Because there's these lines, as you can see, right, between the two normal maps, and with a color ramp I can just pull this white in until that line pretty much disappears, and that's pretty good too. Okay, so we're getting somewhere, because the eyes here and the lines are not gonna need actual materials applied to them other than being emissive. Let me show you how to break this all down into one coherent texture map, or sets of texture maps rather. So first I'm going to go back to the body and re-enable the normal map we've made for it, because again it's pretty heavy, but we're going to need to use it now. And then in every single material we're going to go through and make a image texture. We'll call this the base color, and we'll set a resolution for it. I'm going to at first try 2048 by 2048 because this does need to run in a game engine, and I'd rather not use a 4K texture if I don't need to. There's a lot of detail here, so 4K might be required. Then we make that texture, and we make sure that this base color texture node is selected. Then we just copy that over, and even if a material doesn't do anything with the base color, it's a good idea to still like paste it in, because otherwise sometimes Blender gets a little bit confused. So we paste it in everywhere, make sure that it's the selected node. And with it being in every material now, we can come up here, and as long as we are in the cycles render engine, you probably want to set it to GPU compute because it's faster. We can come down here to the bake menu, and here we can say bake our diffuse, which is the base color, and we're going to only use the color. So no lighting, direct or indirect. And if we press this bake button, it will then bake in every material that has this node selected into this texture, our diffuse map. Which is probably going to take a hot minute, but let's try. You also need to have the object itself selected. That does help. And at the very end of it, we get this texture out of it, which is just our UV islands. We should recognize the rough shape of it with the base color, so no normals, no roughness, no nothing like that, baked onto it. And we can take a look at what's happening here and see if this is detailed enough for our liking. And it might not be. And from there, we just repeat that process for all the different type of texture maps that we want. And I like being able to see the colors and things and the textures while I animate. So I know whether or not things look stretchy and how far I can push things before they start looking a little weird. So I want to have this to be able to animate with. As well as this being the version that I actually will be importing into the game, because it only has one material slot, which we'll call Spider. Because engines like Unreal and Unity automatically see in the FBX, oh, it's got so many material slots. And we'll make, like, in this case, 10 materials for the object. Well, we only really need one. And that's going to save you on draw calls, which will drastically improve performance. Next time, hopefully it's going to be a bit of a shorter process, and as such a shorter video. We're going to be rigging this thing up. And then in the final piece of this mini-series, we're going to be animating it. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page.